Good evening and welcome. My name is Joe Davidge, and I'm the Executive Director here at the Georgia Center for the Book. Thank you for joining us this evening for a virtual artist talk in celebration of The Book is Art, Volume 11, Myth and Magic. A few things before we begin our presentations this evening. Please remember that if you would like to ask a question after our presentations end, you can do so by using the Q&A feature. You can find the Q&A button at the top or bottom of your screen, depending on your device. Please click that button and a chat box will pop up and you can type your question there and we will answer them in turn. You can also type your question in chat, but the Q&A feature helps us to keep track of those questions a bit more easily. We also have the closed caption feature enabled for tonight's program. You can find the closed caption button at the top or bottom of your screen. And when you click on that button, you can manipulate the font size to make it more legible for you to read for this evening's presentation. The Book is Art, of course, wouldn't be an exhibition, artist talks, and all the wonderful things that we do throughout the season were it not for our sponsors and those who help put on this program, like the Decatur Arts Alliance, the DeKalb County Public Library, which hosts the exhibition space, the DeKalb Library Foundation, who of course is a sponsor of the Georgia Center for the Book. And we'd like to thank our judges for making the wonderful selections this year. It was definitely not an easy process. It was a very long process, but they truly produced a magnificent show. We have three artists for you tonight, and I'm going to introduce those to you shortly. Folk tales, fairy tales, and myths are foundational narratives that bridge the secular and the spiritual and merge the factual with the fantastical. Myths and magic transport us and bind us together in the world of imagination. This year's annual Book is Art exhibition explores these concepts visually through beautifully made volumes, sculptural and conceptual interpretations, and one-of-a-kind approaches to the book format. This exhibition of books arts is installed on the fourth floor of the Decatur Library, and the gallery hours are Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturday from 1 to 5 p.m. and by appointment. I would like to note that we will have special hours on October 30th, where we will allow you all to wear gloves and look through some of these fine pieces. We have three presenters this evening. Our first is Patty Kennedy-Zafred from Murraysville, Pennsylvania. The piece that she has in the show is called Shared Destiny. It is hand screen printed images on hand-dyed fabric, digital printing on handmade paper, machine quilted, machine stitched binding techniques, creating a two-sided accordion book. Following her presentation, we have Cynthia Marsh of Edgecombe, Maine. She has three pieces in the show this year. Two are wall installations. One is called Boone Smith Narrative Quilts, which feature fabric, letterpress, and wood type. Claudel Tobacco Hands, which is handmade tobacco paper, letterpress with wood type, and Katika Africa, which is handmade paper, recycled materials, letterpress with wood type. Katika Africa was awarded second place for this year by the judges in our show. And finally, this evening, we have Rachel Simmons of Orlando, Florida. Her book is called Dream of the Golden Empress. It is a double-sided accordion in hardcover magnetic enclosure with letterpress and screen prints on French and Thai kozo papers, book cloth, and decorative Japanese paper. This book was also awarded third place in this year's show by our judges. We are so pleased to have everyone here this evening to share a little bit more about their piece of art, their artistic process. So to begin tonight's presentation, will you please join me to welcome Patty Kennedy-Zafred. Patty?
Good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen and start with my little presentation before the others. I'm from Murraysville, Pennsylvania, which is just outside of Pittsburgh. Need to share my screen, sorry. I live just outside of the Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area, and the piece that I have in this show, which I'm delighted to have been selected for, is Shared Destiny. I am relatively new to bookmaking. Actually, I'm primarily a textile artist and a printmaker, but recently in the last few years have been creating these double-sided accordion books, which I'll share some of that history with you because it's sort of a new thing. This book, Shared Destiny, is sort of a hybrid because it's not just screen print and hand-dyed fabric, which is the nature of most of my 2D work, but also has handmade paper, which was part of a sort of a challenge that was in the group, the Pittsburgh print group, that we were challenged to use handmade paper from the Morgan Conservancy in Kent, Ohio. So this was the piece that I made as part of that particular exhibition. You can see in the details that using the handmade paper was really wonderful because I often add text to my fiber work, but it's much easier to print very detailed text onto paper and then use my hand-dyed fabric and the silk screens to create these accordion books. I was really pleased with the results of that, mainly because you could get so much detail without the risk involved in image transfer, which I often do with, you will see forthcoming, I often do with fabric, and it's not always successful. And certainly it doesn't give you the detail that you get in a book like this. So this book is a hybrid. It's different than the rest of the books you're going to see. And so I'm going to start with the basic image. And I've used this image. This is by Edward Curtis. I use a lot of historical. In the last several decades, I've been focusing on historical images. And this particular, he named it Navajo Boy. It's from 1906. I've used that image in a couple pieces. And I just found him so incredibly remarkably beautiful that I had to use it. And the first time I used it was in a two-dimensional, obviously an art quilt called This Land Was Our Land. And it's all hand-dyed fabric. And again, image transfer and hand-pulled silk screens, photo emulsion screens. But these images are quite tall. These images are probably 20 inches tall, which is pretty much how I tend to work. And what I do with something like this, in a story like this, is I tend to find a photo or an image, and I use the Library of Congress quite a bit to get images, either download or order CDs for silk screens. I tend to look and see what else that photographer was taking on that day or that year, and so then I create this kind of narrative. And I found this image, which was taken at the same place in the same year. So I sort of created in my mind this sort of father-son situation. And in this detail, you can see the hand-dyed fabric, the image transfer, and sort of the detail that you can get with a beautiful big silk screen. I love them as big as I can reach. And my hand dyeing is all done with crochet on MX dyes. And I use shibori dyeing, which is on the poles. I use rope resist, which you can see in these buckets. I use low water emulsion dye. And so you end up with this wonderful palette of color and combination of texture. And so usually my fabrics are dyed 2 or 3 times. And even in this small book, these small pages, the same is true. They were under dyed, over dyed, and so forth. So it creates a lot of layering. And then the screen printing on top even just adds more to it. So typically I print larger, and I print at a print shop called Artist Image Resource, which is in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in the north side. And I'm able to rent space there and clean my screens out because I couldn't do something like this in my home. And so that is a great resource for me. I'm grateful to them. Always have to give them a little plug. But for the book that is in this particular exhibition, those images were printed in my basement at home during COVID. So what happened is they had to shut down, and I could only work with smaller images. So here is a little shot of what happened in my basement. And I was just printing they gave me 3, as you can see on the film up on top. They put 3 smaller images on one screen, and I cut the fabric. I always back all my fabric up with freezer paper. Then when you screen print it, whether it's big or little, I back it with freezer paper, and then it handles like a sheet of paper. So it's much easier to work with. And so I ended up with a whole basement full of these small prints. And I ended up making actually 3 books out of these, but the one that is in the show now was sort of the hybrid and is actually my favorite. So the first book I made was just a few years ago, and it started because I was doing a series that I called Steel Town, about the first time I had ever started to consider doing something about being a Pittsburgh resident and about steel workers. And I found these images, great images, from the early 30s of steelworkers in Pittsburgh, and I decided to make a series of quilts about this time period. And they're different, but this is an example. And so this is a diptych called Steeltown First Shift. There's a second shift and there's a night shift, and but nevertheless, they're all quite different, and they all require different screens. As you can see in this particular quilt, I also acquired the original dues paid buttons. So if you're wondering what those things are that are stuck on the shoulders of these men, in the original photos, I saw that there was like a button, and I researched that, of course, and found out that because they had to pay in cash, they had to receive a button for a month, and every button had the date and the year, and every button was a different color. So of course I went on eBay and started buying up buttons like crazy. So all the quilts had the buttons. So Steeltown First Shift resulted in my very first book. And what happened is typically when I make a 2D work, I print 2 pieces for every one I think I will need, only because you never know what it's going to look like when you get it on the design wall. And so I had all of these incredibly beautiful prints left over. And a friend of mine was working in scrolls. She was doing silk screening and fabric, but she was creating these scroll-like shapes. And I said, well, what are you using? And she said, Peltex. So I went out and I bought some Peltex, and it was nice and stiff, and it has a fusible on it, but that was it. So I fused one of the prints on the front and one on the back and sewed 2 together. And the next thing you knew, I realized that if I hit the stitch and stitched it just right, that they could flip in any direction. So I was totally hooked. So this is my very first book. And during the course of that week, I was making one more page and one more page and one more page, and ended up with this lovely book. And so what you can see, I actually did put a couple buttons on the front page, but I couldn't put them inside or they would have damaged it. But as you can see, this is entirely stitched. So these are screen printed, hand dyed images that are fused to Peltex. It's 2-sided. Then they're quilted. Then they're stitched around the edges, and then the binding is actually stitched. So there is no traditional sort of bookmaking, adhesive or glue or any sort of seaming. Everything is basically it's a textile that has become a 3-dimensional book. And what I love about these is that instead of shipping a 8 or 9 foot quilt, which is usually what I'm shipping at today's rates, about 150 a pop to go somewhere in a tube that's 90 inches, I can flatten these right down to nothing, and you can see how they're all stitched. And so it's really a delight, to work with something that's so manageable. So I really got kind of hooked. So the next thing is here we are still in COVID and post-COVID, but I realized how much I love making these books. And so I started going through all the leftover silk screen prints that I had from past quilts. And so I have this series called American Portraits, which is about the independent family farm. This is just one of those, called The Final Harvest. And using the leftover prints from this particular quilt and other ones, I ended up making Spring Harvest. And so as you can see, it's all hand-dyed fabric using the silk screen images. and into a two-sided accordion book. So I really found these quite delightful to make, and it was a whole new way of showing my work. I did a whole series in the American Portraits where I print on vintage feed sacks and did several of those, not not the same images as this one, but this is an example. And those leftover prints then became Summer Harvest. And these are a little bit harder to, definitely harder to print, and a little bit harder to stitch and work with because they're so raw and they're not even. Some are heavier, some are lighter, but these are not hand dyed. The images are silk screened, but as you can see, the feed sack is the background, which I think it's really great to be a storyteller like I am and suddenly put the story into a book. For me, that's somewhat magical. Now, this one was actually backwards. So what happened with this particular book called Veiled Windows is I had made this quilt with using vintage postcards, and I had done a few of these in the past, but this quilt I had stitched and quilted with metallic thread, and I had done that before many times, but for whatever reason, the quilt was sort of puckery and my perfection just wouldn't allow it. So I never had it photographed. Well, after I had made a few books, I thought, I wonder what I can do with that. So I took this very big quilt, it was 8 feet wide, and I just cut it all up in pieces and put it on the face of a book. So the top, as you see, is actually 3 layers. It's a full 3-layer quilt. So it has the front, the batting, and the backing fused to Peltex, and then the leftover prints are on the back. And so because it had batting, I actually bound it like you would bind a traditional quilt. So that was all hand bound on the edges instead of just zigzag like the rest of them, which was a whole lot easier. This was very difficult to do, but I think it turned out really great, and it put great use to a piece that was not successful. So it became successful. So again, I was working on more advanced silkscreen techniques, and I was doing color separations, posterizations, black and white, and did this series that was, these images are based on watercolor portraits from when Native Americans visited the White House in the early 1830s. And so this was called Warriors in the White House, and the leftovers from that became the White House guest book. So again, you can see the stitching. It has a very heavy textile presence, but it's still very much a book and very much 3-dimensional. And they can be curved. I've seen them installed in various exhibitions, and sometimes they spread them way out, sometimes they make them very tight. And that's kind of the great thing about an accordion book like this, is there is a lot of variation for installation. This is more recent, and this is Sweetness and Sorrow. This is Dust Bowl era on vintage sugar sacks. And this was really the first time that when I went into print, I printed with the express intention of having leftovers to make a book, because by that time I was really hooked on these, having a 2D work and a 3D work out of a print session. And so what resulted was Dust Bowl Diary, and using the images, and then the printed fabric is actually vintage sugar sack, because some of them were advertising type like you see on the images, but others were fabric that women would buy those bags of sugar that way because they could use the fabric for clothing or for whatever. So all of this is true in terms of the age, and the vintage quality, I think, is pretty darn cute. Here's a detail shot of that you can see the sugar sacks, the silk screen prints, and then the vintage fabric. Now, this is one of the most recent quilts I've made. I was concluding the Native American series with the women and girls. This is Daughters of the Earth. And so when I made this particular piece, 2-dimensional work, and of course you can see the shibori techniques and the hand-dyed fabric, I very much was intending to print enough to make a book, because I really felt that this, even though I think this is beautiful two-dimensional work, I really was interested in making this into a three-dimensional work. And so the colorations on the front and the back, I just worked the colors out the way I think that they are going to tell the story a little bit. And again, it's a two-sided accordion book, all hand printed, all handmade fabric, and overlayered. And I'll show you a detail, because when I talk about the overlayers, when you see on the left, for example, the blue or the orange, that's an additional screen print that I've cut and just and fused on top exactly where it would lie. So you lose an entire screen print just for that accent, but I think it's very effective. I do that in my 2D work, and I also do it in my books. And to conclude, this is my most recent quilt. It's called Row White and Blue. I think you probably get the gist of that. And when I made this, I did not have any intention of using any of that for a book, but I did have the intention to make a book. And so I had a very distinct grouping of photos. These are self-portraits of myself when I was in my 20s. And so I had these prints made and used sort of the same technique that I used in the 2D piece, but created again a 3D piece. And I used a lot of overlay of texture in the screens, and to give a lot of, detail and coloration to the piece. And there's a detail. And I hope you enjoyed my little thing. My website is here. It's just pattykz.com. And I have to give credit to Larry Berman, my photographer. He takes great shots of all my work. I think you would agree. And thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so very much, Patty. That was a very, very enjoyable talk. And now I would like to welcome Cynthia Marsh to talk about her 3 pieces that are in our show. Cynthia?
So my name is Cynthia Marsh, and I'm not too technically savvy, so bear with me while I try to get my show. Okay. Okay, so my name is Cynthia Marsh. My studio is Studio One Eye Open. And I have recently moved from Tennessee, near Nashville, to Edgecombe, Maine. I have 3 pieces in the show, and I wanted to talk to you just a little bit about the 3 pieces. The first one is Katika Africa, which means into Africa, 21 days in the savannas of Tanzania. So I'm not as precise as perhaps Patty is about how I make books. And I've been making books since about 1966, which I'm sure is way before most of you were born. But anyway, I try to have the content of the book determine every aspect of the book. So this book is bound in the way that the people I met in Tanzania create the roofs on their houses. They overlap palm fronds and put them together with sticks. And so this is a somewhat known bookbinding, but a little different take. The binding area, everything in the book is made from recycled materials, because everything in Africa is used and used until it falls apart. So here on the binding, we have those large sacks that are woven recycled plastic that everything from cement to potatoes come in. And these were picked up at the marketplace from the street. The paper is all was made by hand with a group of women called the Twiga Group, who live off the grid with their families in a town called Menina, which is about 2 hours east of Kilimanjaro. It is one of the most beautiful places I have ever seen. And the experience of going to Africa was so life-changing that it took me about 5 years to think about it and come to terms with what actually happened to me in Africa. So we went to Africa. We worked with a paper maker there. We worked with a group of 21 women. We gathered twigs from fig trees. We cut them up. We beat them in a rusted container, and then we pounded them by hand, and then we made paper. So here you can see a good example of some of the paper we made. I also brought some of my collection of wood type with me. The women set the type in Swahili and pressed to get an image. They pressed the type onto wet paper with ink that I brought. Okay, so I'm going to run through these slides and not spend a great deal of time on it, but I'm going to read what is written in the book. And this is how I came to terms with what actually happened to me in Africa. Okay, I chose Africa because it sits on the other side of the world. I was seeking an experience so exotic, it would alter my perspective of the human condition. But as history has shown, searching for the exotic is not a new or empathetic way to promote human understanding. How do we distinguish arrogant acts from acts of goodwill? 3 weeks in Tanzania, I took one bite of a banquet prepared by wives, sisters, and friends living in the shadow of history. Welcome the day, work in the soil, care for the sick, use and reuse, rest when the stars shine. And these are some of the women that I worked with. At that time, several years ago, about 40% of the women had AIDS and probably are not with us anymore. It was just the most amazing experience. These women loved their lives so much. They had no desire to come to America or any other place. They lived in what they felt was the most perfect place on earth, even though they had no electricity and no running water. There was one spigot in the center of town, and the families, the women, had to save water for 3 weeks in order to have enough water to do this project. On the side, as you can see of the sheets, there is a running kind of typewriter text, which is from my journal about what happened daily while I was in Tanzania. And I guess one of the things I'm trying to show with this book is, let me get a good example here, is how when you're in a country where you do not speak the language of the people, and you may or may not have an interpreter. There are so many stories going on at the same time. Here we see what's going on in my head superimposed over the story of the woman from Menina who's telling us her story, which is basically her name, how many children she has, and what her favorite thing to do is. This is a polygamous society. Many of these women are in the same household with the same husband and seem very happy about that situation. Everybody has their role. And they're also Islamic, and the chants would start at about 5 a.m. and everything ended when the sun went down because, of course, there was no electricity. Okay, so one of the other pieces I have in the show is based on a more recent project called Tobacco Hands. This was a collaborative project with Marnie Powers Torrey from Utah. And I started this project when I retired from teaching at my university, which was Austin Peay State University in Clarksville, Tennessee. And I want to read you something that I wrote right before I started this project. When I first looked at the concept of retirement, straight in the eyes, my shoulders sank and my gaze fell to the ground. Slowly, as the reality came to pass, I slipped into a hole, an 18-month depression, too deep to describe. The decision to retire is a point in one's life when the shit hits the fan. It is a single step away from finality, no longer building a career, but finishing one. So what is the motivation to continue? An internal discussion about life, death, and eternity ensued. What is important to me? What is the legacy I hope to leave behind? I began to realize that my legacy is not wrapped around the lives of my children or my grandchildren. Certainly, they are important, but my family does not define me. Without judgment, I came to respect every person's right to set their priorities and pursue their chosen endgame. In the words of Henry David Thoreau, if you are ready to leave father and mother, brother and sister, wife or partner and child, and friends, and never see them again, if you have paid your debts and made your will and settled all your affairs, and you are a free citizen, then you are ready for a walk. I believe Thoreau's walk describes the best, most profound work of a lifetime. The work that brings no financial gain, fills no preconception, and answers to no other human being. It is the work saved for the end of one's life, the work you love, the work that defines your essence. With tender ears, wide eyes, and an open heart, I now take daily walks down the woodland trails of New England, and I truly believe my finest work is yet to come. Okay, so then I began Tobacco Hands, and I'm going to try to somewhat quickly go through this. Tobacco Hands is very much the story of my town in Tennessee, which is in an area on the Cumberland Plateau that grows dark fire tobacco. There's only a very small area that grows this kind of tobacco. And here we have a traditional farmer, probably in the early 1800s, plowing the field. And here we have a traditional wedding ring quilt that is from the family of Claudel Wooten. And here we have a tobacco barn that is firing the dark fire tobacco. The barn is filled with tobacco leaves. Hickory logs are on the floor of the tobacco, and they are set on fire, and they burn for about 3 weeks. This type of tobacco is used primarily for pipe and cigar. It's very, very sweet. And it was, its primary use actually was for snuff, which was the drug of choice at the end of the 1800s. And thus, the town of Clarksville was one of the wealthiest towns in the country. So I'm showing you some of the differences between lifestyles of people in Clarksville. We also are on the Cumberland River, which joins the Missouri and the Mississippi rivers, and this is how the tobacco was brought to market. Okay, and here we have a tobacco plant. Here we have the small seeds that go, it's a 13-month crop. They go into the ground in January. And then we have the tobacco seeds flowering early in the summer. Then we have, after the flowering, the topping of the leaves of tobacco. And although not much tobacco is grown anymore, at one time, the entire acreage of the city was filled with these plants. And here we have the tobacco worm. Every family that we interviewed, and we interviewed 4 multi-generational families that have been growing tobacco since the 1700s. And it's always the children's job to remove these tobacco worms. The tobacco worms squirt out tobacco juice, which is poisonous. And years ago, it poisoned the many children who are picking off the worms. Okay, here we have tobacco after it's been picked. It's made into hands, thus the name of our project, Tobacco Hands. Each hand of tobacco, as it's cut from the stalk, has between 6 and 15 leaves to a hand. And here we have a barn, and you can see that the barn has at least 3 tiers, sometimes more, completely filled with hands of tobacco. And here they are drying, smoking. Here's a tobacco leaf. This is Marnie and myself as we're working on the project. Now, I worked on gathering the material for this project for about 5 years, interviewing people and going to different farms before we actually started. And then Marnie said, I would like to collaborate with this project. I come from South Carolina originally. I know about the importance of tobacco to our history, whether or not it is a poison that we no longer promote. So I could not visualize how to make this hand of tobacco. I knew we were going to make paper out of tobacco leaves, and I knew we were incorporating quilts, traditional quilts that related to the separate farmers. So she came up with this project. We made about 300 sheets of tobacco paper, then printed on the paper with wood type, which seemed suitable for the time and for the information we were putting forth. The quilt underneath is the Flying Geese quilt. And this quilt, although it's not, this was Marnie's first quilt, and it inspired me to make my quilts. And together we made 4 8-foot sections of tobacco hands. This particular farmer was African American. He has an amazing story that goes back to the 1700s. And the flying geese quilt, what some feel was a quilt that was laid over railings and fences to let slaves know how to find the way to the Freedom Railroad, to the Underground Railroad. Okay, Claudel Wooten grew up on a farm in Erin, Tennessee, one of 18 children, and they lived in a 3-bedroom house. Going to this farm was an amazing experience. Claudel has since passed away. I felt because of the simplicity of her life, the log cabin quilt was most suitable. So I set the type and printed it as if it was part of a log cabin quilt. So this is one of the lockups before it was printed, letterpress. Okay, now I'm going to go through the leaves that are on her quilt. My father, he married Stella Ruth Smith, and they cropped 200 acres. When I was 8, the oldest of their 3 children at the time, my mother died. Mother sewed all my dresses. After she died, Pa bought me overalls like the boys. Later, father married Addie Mae Rose. They raised 15 more children. One Christmas, my father gave me a doll with 10 eyes and 10 curls. And here is the finished quilt. It has all of the quilted blocks, which are made out of paper, of course, on a kind of structure that was then squished together with methyl cellulose. And somehow I found a way to ship it to Georgia. And I have no idea what it looks like hanging there, but I just hope it looks okay. And underneath those leaves was a quilt that I designed about Claudel. And this is also in the log cabin style. And it's talking about the 3 parts to her life: the family, the layout of their farm, and the growing of tobacco. So I think that's it for my talk. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. That was absolutely wonderful. And I can assure you that those tobacco leaves look absolutely stunning hanging on the wall. They hang on the wall nearest my office. It's funny how those things seem to work out. But yes, it looks absolutely wonderful. However, I probably will come up with a different way to ship those back to you, but it truly was ingenious, I have to say. And next, we're going to bring up Rachel Simmons, and she is going to discuss the piece that she has in the show. Rachel?
Thanks for having me, everyone. I'm delighted to be included in this show with so many very talented artists. It was really nice to hear from the first 2 artists about their work, and I have questions for you later. I'm going to just introduce you to my practice and then share a bit about how I created Dream of the Golden Empress and where the inspiration for that book came from. So I'm going to show first just some images of work from, I guess, the last couple of years. So I've been making artist books for a long time, but I guess my background is really, my MFA is in painting and drawing. So I happened to come back to book arts, which I did as an undergrad, once I was hired at my alma mater, Rollins College, which is here in Central Florida. It's a small liberal arts school founded in the late 1800s. And I get to teach all kinds of students. We do have a studio major, but I get to teach philosophy majors and econ majors and all kinds of people with lots of interests. I'm just scrolling back to the beginning of this. And so since I also went to school at Rollins and have a liberal arts education myself, my interests in art are always connected to other issues. One of the things that I explore most often in my work is our relationship with the environment around us. And I also do travel quite a bit in order to produce my work. Traveling is one of the things that I do that I enjoy the most as an artist. It really expands my horizons. And like Cynthia, I think very carefully about the places I go and the impacts I'm having and the sort of takeaways that I introduce in my books through those experiences. So just looking back on a couple of works, this one is called Tracking B-15, and it's about the largest iceberg to have broken off from Antarctica. It happened in the year 2000. And it took almost 18 years for B-15 to finally melt every last little piece of it. And I don't know if anybody remembers that event, but it was about the size of Connecticut. So it was a very big chunk of ice, and it was very startling for the scientific community. And so my idea was to create a fictional character, Palmer Brown, which is a hybrid of two names of Antarctic's research stations, Palmer Station and Brown Station. And in this narrative, Palmer Brown becomes a fan of B-15 and ends up tracking it as an amateur scientist for 18 years. He kind of gets obsessed, actually, and he starts renaming all of the bergy bits that break off from B-15 with other B names like Bootsy Collins and Bilbo Baggins. This book is called Based on Your Current Trajectory. And it's a little bit more recent than that one that we just saw. It includes, again, this connection to science. So I looked at Stephen Hawking's theories of time travel. And one of the things that struck me the most was the twin paradox, in which two twins of the same age, one stays on Earth and one travels at the speed of light and returns to Earth later, and they've aged differently because of the way time affects us while traveling at the speed of light. So I sort of took that theory and I created, again, a kind of fictionalized narrative about a time traveler looking for their lost twin in space. And it is a flag book, but it sits flat. And you kind of look through it with your fingers like you would index cards in a box. These are a couple spreads from a big altered book that I did called Birds of the World, in which I cut apart, I think, 100-page lavishly illustrated book on birds. I took all the birds out of the book and then I put them back into the book in different places. And it's really a commentary on species decline amongst bird populations, but also it has this personal narrative running through it of all of my own experiences seeing birds in unusual places like Antarctica, Iceland, and Namibia. This one I did after Birds of the World. It's called Weather Atlas, and it's also a pretty lengthy altered book. I used a weather atlas of the United States that was printed in, I think, 1977, and incorporated imagery from actually 4 other books into this book, and essentially talking about how climate change is affecting species on Earth and our relationship as consumers to conservation, to try to preserve habitats. And also in my work, very often I'm talking about my own experiences as a consumer living inside of this system. And so it isn't necessarily about being some kind of perfect environmentalist. It's more about this really practical take on how difficult it is to feel empowered to do anything about things like climate change. There's another image from that book. This is a collaborative book that I've created with Ben Reinhardt. He is a good friend of mine who teaches at a very similar school in Wisconsin. We actually joke that we have basically the same job, the same life. And we decided to collaborate on a book about our fathers a couple years back. We started this over the pandemic, and we Zoomed together, interviewed each other, and then we were able to physically get together about a year after starting the book to actually print the components. And they're two flexagons, also called rotating rings, with imagery of our fathers, and also an interview where we asked one another what it was like to grow up with our fathers who both experienced mental illness. My father had passed away when we did this book, and Ben's father has dementia and is in a nursing home. So neither one of us really had access to them. So we interviewed each other about our dads, and we're currently working on a book about our moms. This is a book that I finished this year, and it's about I've been to Iceland a couple of times. The last time was last summer, and I got to do a residency where I worked with actual Icelandic metal type, which was very exciting. There's a lot of interesting and unique characters in the Icelandic language that don't exist anywhere else. And Icelandic is a compound language. So many of the words, if you can break the words down, you can learn a lot about the thing that the word is describing. It's called Learning Icelandic Rivers. And this one is also a kind of meditation on a travel experience. I've been to Antarctica twice, and the first time I went was on my own. And I had just a lot of really, I guess, existential experiences listening to glaciers crack and being in such a remote place. So this book is a sort of meditation on the sounds that glaciers make, and also on the Anthropocene and what we're kind of how human behavior can impact a place as remote as Antarctica. This is another book about my journeys there. I went 2 years in a row, and the second time, both times I went on a ship called the Lubov Orlova, which later, as it was being towed away to be scrapped, escaped, so to speak, floated away, and is now a ghost ship and has never been found again. So I think that happened a couple years after my last trip on her, and I decided to do a book about the Lubov Orlova because it has had such an impact on me. So it's a tunnel book. I think you can see that from the slides. I also make a lot of zines. Zines are super quick, fun, fast, but sometimes really profound exercises for me in working with printed materials. So you can see a lot of like monotype and relief printing in these, even though it's a digital zine. This is another piece called Antarctica and Explorers Archive. So being alone, traveling alone as a woman in a place like Antarctica is, I started thinking about that, about having the privilege of doing that. And also this narrative of British heroic age explorers like Ernest Shackleton is well known, but women explorers are often overlooked. So there's a kind of erasure, I guess, of the Alfred Lansing book about Shackleton's 1914 voyage on the Endurance to Antarctica. And the vials in the second component of the book contain what I think of as essentials: transportation and courage, warmth. So I have a pair of socks that I wore on the trip that are embroidered in that third vial over. So this is the book that's in the show. It's called Dream of the Golden Empress. And it came about through some found text. So it also incorporates Lego printing, which is the first time I've used that in an artist book. And I'm just obsessed with it now. If anybody hasn't printed Legos yet, you have to. It's super fun. It's also kind of an experimental form of letterpress printing, which involves pressure printing. And it's a deliberate attempt to obscure the language. So it's based on a story, and it's a very familiar kind of allegory about an emperor who is corrupt, who brings society to the brink of destruction through selfishness, which, being from Florida, is the kind of narrative that we have every day in the news. And so I wrote this allegory thinking about current US politics. I really enjoy being a writer. Through my artist books, I get to explore lots of different dimensions of writing, fictional writing, poetry, erasures. So writing is really important to me. And recently I've been reading aloud from these books with writer friends of mine. So that's kind of cool to sort of branch out and become just a little bit more, I don't know, a little bit into the literary community, which is super fun. I do have a little video that I can share. Let me see if I have that ready to go. I think I do. Let's find out. Okay, here. So this just walks through the book. You can see there's two sets of text. One is sort of this narrative component that runs in 6 chapters. And the second is are these almost like letterpress posters that are inserted in between the chapters. The letterpress is meant to represent the voice of the Empress, who's gonna save the day and fix everything, but she's also trying to tell the people who elected the emperor that really need to fix their own problems, that there really isn't a swift fix for these sorts of messes. And on the backside, you can see the Lego imagery is of the Empress. The way that she fixes everything is through love and compassion. So she does kind of like a joyful dance and gives herself a hug and pulls everything back together. So I'll go back to these photos now. So the way that the book came about is kind of interesting. I guess it sort of makes sense for me because I often use found text in my work. So I had done this huge letterpress demo with wood type, and I had trays and trays of wood type out on the shop, and I was kind of gathering them up and putting them away. And you know what a process that can be if you work with type. So I had a tray of random words, and I looked at that tray and I thought, well, what if I just, wrote something and my limitation was to use only the letters on this tray. And then I ended up writing the word Empress, and this was the first message that I wrote, which was Empress over barren golden courts. And I produced a suite of prints for Hamilton Way's Goose, using collage and using these letterpress prints. And then as I continued to make them, I knew there was more happening. So I kept making them, and this time I had a more deliberate size, and I always used like 5 lines, and I had this, again, I think I flourished when I had this like box to play in. So I gave myself some rules of the game. And I used letterpress and pressure printing to break up the letters. So there's transparency, there's laying of color, and there's also pressure printing. So I'll show you a couple of videos of it in progress. This is a second layer going on top. And underneath that paper is the pressure plate. If you've never done pressure printing, it's putting a soft, malleable plate, low relief plate behind your paper as you run it through. So whatever is creating that pressure kind of pushes through to the front. You can see a different angle here. And this is our studio, our letterpress studio at Rollins. We have a pretty small space, but we have a Vandercook and some flatten presses, lots of provisional presses. Because I was a student at Rollins, I've been working on that Vandercook for, gosh, how long now? 40, no, 28 years, a long time. Okay, so let's look at a couple other images. We'll skip this one. Okay, so this is another page out of the book being printed. And it took me a couple months to work through printing this. And unlike a lot of my book projects, I didn't necessarily have a plan the whole time. I kind of wanted to see where this series would take me. So I just printed and printed and printed, knowing that there was something happening and that I really liked the messages I was creating. They felt like protest posters. They felt like just a way to like speak up in a really difficult political environment. And I started to just really fall in love with the imagery too. Like this sort of, I used Tycozo by Legion, which is just really by default, it's a great paper, but it's really inexpensive too. So we keep it in the studio for the students' projects, and I love using it. So I was working a lot with layering and fracturing to make the images vibrate almost, to have volume, even though the paper was really soft. You can see one of the lockups there. And then this one, I did a little bit differently. I had a mask that I put on to block out part of the type so that I could basically save an area of color. So I'll peel it off here and you can kind of see what that looks like. You can see where the masking created some shadow. So then I worked on Lego printing. I decided after writing the story that I needed to represent the figure of the Empress, but because it was an allegory and this had this really like mythological origin story, I didn't want it to have a very recognizable representation. I did a drawing and it was just like too specific. So I thought this language of Legos was a lot like, you know, primitive block printing. It has this mathematical, you know, component of the blocks that are all the same size and all the same shape. And then I started working with them and doing almost like animation because of the way they flex and move. So here at home, I just have a provisional press that I work on. So I started setting this figure of the Empress and then sort of changing her movements and then overlapping those movements so that she started to dance. This is a puppet that my friend brought me back from India. And it's a character from the sagas who has like 10 heads. And every single one of his joints moves. And that was one of the inspirations for having the Empress move in the way that she did, almost like a puppet would move, like these jointed limbs that she has. So there's just a little, little sneak peek of what that looks like to do a little bit of Lego printing. I just did some with my students tonight. That's what we were doing before I headed over for the talk. And they really like it a lot. I think they're all familiar with Legos, having grown up in this generation of playing with them. But thinking about them as a way to create relief prints is a new thing for them. And you can kind of see like, it's like built for letterpress, right? It's like a modular type almost. It's really pretty, it's pretty easy to fit in with your printing practice. And I find on the Tycozo, I get this really beautiful speckled kind of soft texture. That's really lovely. I do a little bit of hand printing and a little bit of rolling with the provisional press. So yeah, you can see how that texture is it's so fascinating and interesting. So yeah, I ended up making like every edition of the book, it's an edition of 10, is unique because every sequence of the Empress dancing is unique. And the letterpress prints on the other side are also, I'm just not one of those artists that loves to repeat everything exactly. I love variation. I love throwing in a different color palette and seeing what happens. And so that's what I have. I'm all done. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Rachel. That was absolutely fascinating. And I do believe, didn't Fractured Fathers win last year as well?
I think it did.
At least I was looking and trying to see. I was like, I believe, you know, you have a good track record going.
I do.
Yeah.
I do. I appreciate it.
So Patty and Cynthia, if you want to join us back on the screen, we can sort of all have a chat. You all can ask each other questions. Don't forget, if anyone in the audience has any questions, please feel free to type those into the Q&A or into the chat so we can get those asked. But Rachel, not to put you on the spot, but you did mention that you had some questions. And you know, although I admire art greatly, I always like it so much better when folks who are in the industry ask the folks in the industry about their particular work. So not to put you on the spot, but go ahead and maybe fire one or two of those off.
Yeah, I do. I have one for each of you. I'll start with Patty. I was interested to know like where your interest in Indigenous peoples and like blue collar workers, why those particular subjects interest you so much and where that interest might come from.
Actually, Rachel, I in the last couple decades, I would say for the last, especially the last 15 years, prior to that time, I was working with a lot of personal images, and the quilts were very, what should I say, personal and vulnerable. And when I decided to sort of pivot and learn to screen print and make images larger, I really was intrigued by historic images and telling stories that I felt that I didn't necessarily know about or that related to me. So the American Portrait series, I'm from a small town in Ohio. The first time I saw those images in the black and white collection, it was like, boom, I know those people. They look familiar to me. You know, I'm well over 70. So I remember they looked familiar. So also I was aware not only in Ohio, but also with family members in other parts of the Midwest and in the Pittsburgh area of all the independent family farms just like disappearing. And so that is what was the sort of the crux of the American Portrait series. The Native American images initially were simply because they were simply so beautiful. They, you know, the chiefs, I did some Native American chiefs, the piece, the silkscreen images were 24 inches high. I made them larger than life, and it was sort of a reflection on the fact that here they were going through this horrible transition in the 1830s and so forth, and they still have never, they are still discriminated against. They still encounter this, you know, problem and bias in the country today. So it, you know, kind of what I do is when I think about these works is there a connection from the past to the present? So to me, there is a connection from the past to the present. And so that's that's how they resonate in my mind, is to create this sort of story that people look and say, oh, that was 1930. Well, no, that's today in a way, if you know what I'm trying to say. So yeah, it's not, I concluded the Native American series with the women. I had never done a series with the women, but that series has been concluded. I think I'm pretty much done with the American portraits. You get to sort of a point that you know that you've told that story. So I think that one's sort of finished at this point, but yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting that you talk about telling stories. I didn't see text in your books. Is it
There's text
primarily
in, yeah,
images?
there's text in both my 2D and 3D work. Yeah.
Oh, okay, okay, great. Yeah.
And usually what I do is I utilize text, or typically in the 2D work, what I have done in the past is I look up I have a degree in journalism, so I don't have a degree in art. So I look up old newspaper articles that relate to the time period. So for example, in the first ship, the Steelworker series, the articles that are all surrounding them in the background are from when they were trying to form a union, when things like that were happening, because that's when those photos were being taken.
Yeah.
So, it helps the viewer put the story together.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. And actually that connects with the question that I have for Cynthia, which is like doing work about a community that's your own or that you have connection to makes sense, but how you navigated working with a community that was so different from yours, and having also traveled to Africa and other countries, I'm constantly aware of my privilege as a white woman, and I'm also trying to kind of be open and absorb a space, but also be like really cognizant of my presence in that space. And so it sounds to me like you had to kind of wrestle with that quite a bit before you figured out where you landed, and maybe you're still thinking about it, but I really liked how you talked about like digesting that trip for 5 years or so before you went into it. Did you have the same kind of timeline for the Tobacco Hands project, or was it easier to connect with that community because it was an American community? Or I don't know where my question is exactly, but maybe you can suss it out.
Actually, yeah, I did wrestle quite a bit with not so much. It was more internal about why I went to Africa and what I did go there as a privileged white woman, and realized very quickly that that was such bullshit, that those women had a sense of their hands in the soil and raising their own food, et cetera, that was so genuine. Um, I think that the words kind of speak to that. But the thing, my whole work at the university, I bought a collection of wood type that is huge from Massachusetts, and trucked it down to Tennessee. So I made 4 or 3 movable presses that could go out into the street. And I spent 25 years collecting stories from the public. So we would take a topic, and it's a very, very, like everywhere in the United States, divided society. It has the second largest military base in the country in our city, and we have 40,000 soldiers in our city. And so we did lots of work where people would come and talk about their experiences in Afghanistan, and lots of people in the same group talking about anti-war experiences. anyway, I think from all that community work, I got to know the community pretty well, and actually made fantastic lifelong friendships with the people that I interviewed. And they were not the same people now than they were, let's say, 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago. So from humble beginnings, or from, farm life, moved into academia or whatever. I don't know if that's a good answer, but
Oh, that's great. Thank you.
yeah. I feel some kinship with your work, and some not, because it's so scientific,
Hmm.
and you go after such they're not really internal emotional situations the way that I go after that sort of thing. um, and speaking right now, I'm working on a book about New England, about colonial life in New England. And my family came here in the 1600s to Maine. So I've got that background. And talking about what Patty said about the Native Americans, there are all these colonies on the East Coast that were started way before the Puritans came. They were started in the 1500s. They were fishing and hunting communities. And when you read a first person narrative of meeting the Native Americans, every single time it's the men and the women, but particularly the men, were so beautiful and so clean. And they looked at the Europeans and they said, who are these smelly, hairy people who have not had a bath in a year? So there you go. I don't know if that helps your, Patty, your work on Native Americans.
Well, I can say the one thing that I admire about both of your works is that Artist Image Resource, where I print, does have a letter press, but they don't have a collection. The only the only blocks they have are things that they've acquired from newspapers. So they're like super tiny. And I'm friends with Amos Kennedy Jr. I hope both of you know who the heck he is. And so anyway, I just like am so envious that you have these collections, because I would love to experiment with that sort of thing, but I don't have the opportunity right now. Although Amos has invited me to come to Detroit, so I just might do it. So, but in any event, I love the letter block. And Cynthia, you blow me away, because when you had quilts at the end of this piece, I was just like, oh God, thank you. Because it is a crossover. Textiles and bookmaking is such a great crossover in my mind. But the thing that you said that resonated with me the most, because we're both older than Rachel for sure, and you said, my finest work is yet to come.
Mhm.
That resonated with me, because I'm not done yet. I don't think you're done yet. And I do love that.
Well,
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, that piece was a bit long to read, but I think that when you're teaching, when you're young, you're right in the thick of your building your community and building your work. And when you get toward the end of your life, and I never would guess you're 70. I mean, I'm
over 70.
well, I'm about to have my 75th birthday next week. So I'm planning a big whoop-de-doo because I made it. Anyway, yeah, so I think that it's very hard. Change is hard, and getting a viewpoint on your life is hard. And but it's kind of what it's all about. So anyway, enough about that.
Anyway, I love that line.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm waiting for your finest work to still come.
Okay. Hey, you're welcome to come and print in my studio.
I would love to.
Right on the ocean. It's very beautiful. So send me an email.
Thank you.
Well, Patty, Cynthia, Rachel, thank you all so much. We could probably keep going. This is a great show. And I think one of the takeaways from this evening and coming off of Banned Books Week is the amazing ability of listening to other people's stories and placing them and placing yourself in their lives and doing so in an empathetic and artistic way. And I think that's a great way that the themes that you all incorporate in your work accomplish. And I think it's a wonderful little period to Banned Book Weeks and to talk about art and books in such a way. I am also happy to let folks know that, Katika Africa and Shared Destiny have been purchased by Emory University, the Rose Manuscript Library. So they will live just a few miles from the Decatur Library. And that Dream of the Golden Empress was purchased by SCAD Atlanta. So that will live in their book collection as well. So very happy that these all have new homes so near and dear, so we can rifle through those. And of course, Cynthia, your quilts and your tobacco leaves have a home right now near my office. It's funny how they both ended up near my office. But you can talk to Allie about that. Things seem to end up that way in art shows. Once again, Patty, Rachel, Cynthia, thank you so much for sharing so much about your work, sharing so much of your insights and about yourself with us this evening. Folks, do come and see the show. There are a few days remaining, but there are great opportunities, especially on October 30th for White Glove Night. We will have one more of these artist talks next week, so do sign up for that so you can get the Zoom link. I hope all of you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you all again very, very much, and we will see you all again very soon. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.